I'm Shelly Horton. I'm a journalist and I'll be hosting this Patient Voice Initiative series. When the Australian government subsidises a health service or medicine, it wants to know if it's good value for money. To find out, it uses an internationally recognised research process called Health Technology Assessment, which studies evidence from the clinical trials and economics to answer key questions about its safety, its effectiveness, and its cost compared to existing treatments. The process relies heavily on robust scientific evidence. But not everything that matters to patients and their families is captured in this evidence. The committee's reviewing can be left with many questions, including questions that patients can answer. Questions like, are these outcomes that are important to patients? How different would patients trade off the risk to the benefit? Is the new treatment being compared to an appropriate existing treatment? And are there needs among patients and their families that we don't know about, that we need to think about when determining the value of this treatment? Often, insights from patients and their support groups help to answer these questions. Another approach is to conduct research to generate robust evidence about patients' needs, preferences, and experiences. This is sometimes called patient-based evidence. And in this video, we'll cover what it is, what value it might add to submissions you make to the Pharmaceutical Benefits Advisory Committee and the Medical Services Advisory Committee, and other bodies that advise on the value of health services. I've asked our experts back to help break it down. First up, we have Jessica Bean. Living with cystic fibrosis, she's a patient advocate, international speaker, consultant and empowerment coach for young women living with chronic illness.
Thank you so much, Shelly. What a pleasure to join you today.
Next up, it's Simone Laden. After the death of her sister to a rare cancer, Simone co-founded NeuroEndocrine Cancer Australia, which advocates for greater access to treatments as well as funding clinical trials and research.
Hi, thanks for having me.
We also have Dr. Simon Pfeiffer, whose PhD research into patient preferences will help build health systems that better meet patients' needs.
Thanks for having me.
And we have Anne Single, the chair of Health Technology Assessment International's Patient and Citizen Involvement Interest Group, which brings together more than 400 people internationally to push for practical patient involvement.
Hello.
Okay, Simon, I'll start with you. What is patient-based evidence?
Patient-based evidence is a broad term, basically generally covering all sorts of research where we're gathering information from patients, could be qualitative and quantitative, but really is to find out what it's like living with the condition, preferences and outcomes that are important to them. So it is a broad term, but it really is about doing research and gathering information and presenting that evidence to stakeholders.
What sort of things matter to patients that aren't captured in traditional evidence?
I think patient-based evidence has the potential to capture some of those things that it would be a real shame to miss. Some of the things that if you don't live with the condition, you might think are the small things, but they're actually the really, really big things.
Well, look, again, in the space that we're in, which is a less common cancer, we rely on specialty centres. And these specialty centres are generally found within the metro cities, and we know that, so many of our patients are also located in regional areas. So things that are not captured is that convenience or that the access issues that many patients face.
What value does patient preference research, qualitative research, patient-reported outcome measures add to decision-making about reimbursing treatments?
Well, it holds a lot of value because these committees, when they're making their decisions, they don't always have a lot of information coming from the patient perspective and the patient point of view. So this type of research fills in those gaps when they're making that decision. And if we don't do these types of research, there's a lot of questions that go unanswered that the people on these committees don't know. So they're very important pieces of the puzzle that go into the decision-making context for these committees when they're making their decisions.
So patient preference studies help us to understand the different trade-offs that different patients might make. And patient-reported outcome measures, well, that's really all about capturing those outcomes that really matter to patients. It could include things like reduced pain levels or reduced fatigue. maybe the better management of a symptom that's socially stigmatizing. And patient-based evidence helps the reimbursement committees understand what the benefits and risks of a treatment are going to look like for patients in the real world. For example, sometimes a benefit that looks quite small in a clinical trial might be something really useful, really important to patients. And the other thing about patient-based evidence is it helps these committees overcome some of the assumptions they usually have to make. And so they can look at this information and they can feel confident in it because it comes from robust scientific methods. So they understand the basis for the claims it makes.
Why have you invested in patient-based evidence research?
We really wanted to try and educate patients and upskill them to ensure that they had the ability to contribute to what the research and what the outcomes of that for them would be.
What's the most challenging aspect of the research?
I think we've underestimated the patient in the past, and it's sort of been a tick the box process. But now we really believe that patients can really drive the agenda. They really need to be ensuring that their preferences are put at top and centre. And by doing so, you're actually going to see a knock-on effect for the healthcare system and for better research.
Can you do it in-house or do you need to pay a professional?
You can do it both ways. You can do it in-house if you have some experience, and definitely looking at what other people have done and leveraging off that. So in-house in particular, if you're doing things like case studies, patient stories, analysing themes coming from that, that's certainly possible. Doing basic types of surveys is certainly possible as well, and I've seen a lot of advocacy groups doing that. It's when it gets to some more of the harder types of methods, like sometimes patient-reported outcomes and certainly patient preferences, where you might look to leverage off the skills of a professional really in regards to people who've had experience in doing that type of work, because it's a little bit more complicated than just running a survey. So you'd want to look to someone to help you with those particular techniques.
Well, look, we've always done it in-house because we are a small, very small organisation. We try and look bigger than we are, but we are a small organisation. So we have done it in-house with the support of different stakeholders, and we wouldn't be able to do what we do either without the incredible support of our healthcare professionals and the collaborative approach we have with them. So it doesn't need to be complicated. Yes, the app and the registry that we have heavily invested in is a very complicated process. We've gone through ethics. We have it in hospitals around the country, and yes, that was a very costly thing. However, simple surveys and patient interviews and those sorts of research is only sometimes patient organisations can do, because they know what questions to ask and they also know how to access these patients. And there's a huge trust between the patients and the patient organisations. So it doesn't need to be complicated. It can present itself, this research can present itself in any way, shape or form, as long as we're really trying to get to the importance of what the patient is actually saying and what value they can bring to assessing what these medicines can do.
Are there specific challenges when you do research to support a submission?
Yeah, there are real challenges when you want to do research and put it in to hope to impact on a reimbursement decision. Those committees that look at the evidence for reimbursement decisions are looking for really specific areas of research. And that's why when patient groups undertake patient-based evidence research, it's really useful to spend time talking to those people on those committees about what sort of uncertainties they're finding in the evidence that relates to people with the condition the patient group is representing. What sort of questions would be really valuable to undertake in the research? Because you might not want to just use this committee for this research for reimbursement decisions, but it's really important that your information is specific enough to address the questions that arise.
There are lots of challenges, I think, but the really, really big one is that patient groups and patients don't always understand what the committee needs, what is important for the committee to know in that process. And if you don't know those things, you can't specifically go out and try and capture them. So that knowledge is really, really important before you even try and start to tackle patient-based evidence. The other thing I think is it's important that groups that are trying to put together patient-based evidence really know their community. They know what matters to their community and they know what the unmet needs are. And that makes sure that when they make that investment of taking the time and perhaps financial investment of putting that patient-based evidence together, then really hitting the mark with what the community needs and feels.
One of the key challenges is really making sure that your research question is correct. So these bodies are really particular that it maps to the exact question that they're looking at in the submission. So that's one particular area that would be important to note, is making sure your research question is the correct question that they're looking at in the submission. The other couple of questions to look at are really to do with making sure that you can get some feedback. So it's difficult when you do this type of research, you put something in and you don't know exactly whether it impacted the decision because there's not a huge amount of transparency in how it was used. So getting feedback can certainly be a challenge as to whether your research it did make a difference or would make a difference. And some of the other challenges are really also dealing with some jargon. Sometimes there's a bit of jargon used in these committees and even in when they're making their decisions. So it's sort of like going through that and trying to understand what was important when they were making decisions, weeding through that jargon. So there are a couple of challenges when you're doing this type of work and it goes to these committees.
So hopefully that clears up the questions about patient-based evidence. Thank you to all of our experts. Next up, it's time to get started. I'm Shelly Horton. Thanks for watching.